And those two events brought Republicans and Democrats, progressives and conservatives together on this issue. Because on the conservative side, they saw that these two extremes that existed in these societies, in the Philippines and Chile, from the Marcos on one side and the communist insurgency on the other, and in Chile from Pinochet on one side and the communist insurgency, that there was an alternative, that these two extremes enjoyed the symbiotic relationships in these countries. They drew strength from each other. And in the process, the democratic forces from left to right got squeezed out. And once they were given an opportunity to compete and participate, and that they drew international solidarity and support for their democratic struggle, they were able to provide an alternative to these two extremes. And on the progressive side, on Capitol Hill, for the first time they realized that this was not just a Cold War vehicle. They were suspicious because of Ronald Reagan's support, but it was actually designed to support democratic forces and human rights around the world. So those two events, in Chile and the Philippines, and the role that the National Endowment for Democracy played and NDI played in those places, changed the debate here in Washington. And then the fall of the Berlin Wall, and this all became very sexy. The notion of supporting democracy and human rights around the world. And USAID began providing additional support for this effort. And also there was a change in the traditional development community as well. There was a time that the traditional development community thought that we could bring the principles of the Marshall Plan to the developing world, that we provided the needed economic and development assistance, and that would provide stability and economic growth and prosperity in these societies. But it was soon discovered that many of the problems that existed in the developing world were not economic in nature, they were political in nature. And that in societies where there was economic dislocation and rampant poverty and environmental degradation, it was places where people did not have a voice, where governments could exploit the people. There were no checks and balances in society, in government. And that corruption, that even enlightened dictatorships, eventually over time, hubris sets in, and a culture of corruption. And so there began an understanding, if not an appreciation, for this linkage between democracy and development. That these went hand in hand. And this began to be the view of the development community, of donor aid agencies in many countries around the world. What was unusual and different, that you had an intergovernmental organization, intergovernmental in a way that not all democracies were members of this intergovernmental organization, namely the United Nations. That you had an agency which was the international development arm of the United Nations, like USAID is the international development arm of the US government. But unlike the US government, the UN is made up of democracies and non-democracies. But it was almost revolutionary that this intergovernmental organization, the UNDP, in 2002 came out with a human development report that linked democracy and development, and even went a step further by saying that democratic politics and human development were inexorably linked. And this was, as I said, revolutionary and quite controversial, I think, among many of the member states of the United Nations that were fearful that their own authorities would be challenged by the intergovernmental agency of which they were a member. Nevertheless, the UNDP took on this fight, never abandoned the principles that were laid down in that 2002 Human Development Report. And since that time, the democracy and governance portion of the UNDP portfolio increased over the years to where it is about somewhere in the neighborhood of 40%, 50% today, which ended up bringing me to the United Nations and then to the UNDP when then Administrator of the UNDP, Mark Malloch Brown, asked if I would serve as the interim president of the U.S. Committee for the UNDP. That was, I don't know, 6 years ago. So I'm still the interim president of the UNDP. But I think that there was a recognition on the part of the UNDP of this linkage between democracy and development, and a boldness on the part of this organization to take on this issue in such a forthright way. And secondly, it was a view of the UNDP that it could enhance its work by partnering with others on the ground that were carrying out these important development efforts, both, as Fred said, in pursuit of the Millennium Development Goals in terms of reduction of poverty, but viewing democracy and human rights as a vehicle through which those goals can best be met. And that's where there has been and the UNDP has been playing a lead role in bringing these two communities together around the world, those that are advocates of democracy and human rights, and those that are advocates of development and poverty reduction. And I've always felt that this was rather significant, and I've always felt that this was a comfortable partnership, and I've been very proud to have played a small role in supporting the UNDP's efforts and trying to help educate others about how far-reaching the UNDP programs are. And it is often, as a supporter of the U.S. government's role in development and democracy, I also have been able to see the value of having an intergovernmental organization, not the U.S. government, but an intergovernmental organization speaking the democracy lexicon. Particularly as a result of the controversy over democracy promotion because of the Iraq War and because of the controversy over the previous administration's democracy freedom agenda among some. Having an intergovernmental organization, being advocates of democracy and human rights, this is not something about American hegemony. It's not about the imposition of a form of government, but rather it represents sort of universal values and universal rights. And that's why it's so important that the UNDP has carried this banner, and that's why it's so important that the U.S. UNDP has played this type of role on the ground in so many countries around the world. So it has served a great service to those in many countries around the world who are engaged in these struggles for fundamental human and political rights. People who desire to put food on their table, but also to have a political voice. But it has also served U.S. interests because it has been an effective voice and advocate for issues that the United States has long believed in.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting.